All right. Next up in our fun fact series on data providers, we're going to talk about how to best evaluate a base data provider. When I say base data, I don't mean an intent data provider. I don't mean a voodoo magic data provider. I mean your good old-fashioned contact and company level information. Things like number of employees, things like work emails, LinkedIn profile, job title, etc., etc. The standard, lifeblood of any B2B go-to-market function. So the first thing you're going to obviously want to do is define your needs. The most common B2B data needs include building prospecting lists for outbound purposes, enriching your CRM with basic firmographic information, enriching lists with valid work emails and verified mobile phone numbers. And then any extra data that's important to your business but may not isn't necessarily typical. That could be technographic information of companies you integrate into. It could be things like funding if you're going after startups. There's a long list of what I would call niche data columns that might be highly relevant to you in terms of qualifying or scoring your top accounts. But that maybe not the base data provider might not have. So we'll talk about the sort of result of this at the very end, but the kind of TLDR is that you'll often end up with between 1 and 3 data providers as you mature to around Series B. And then when you talk Series C or D+, you may have as many as, you'll have north of 5 data providers, and that's fairly typical. Okay. So the goal in evaluating these data providers, a base data provider, is ultimately to understand these providers along 4 key quadrants. One is how many rows does it have within your ICP? Second is what is the fill rate and availability of key fields that are important to you to be able to filter off of or to be able to append to a record to score it. The third is then, of course, data accuracy. And the last would be work email enrichment accuracy or phone number accuracy as well. Doing this right takes time. So I'll say that if you're a Series A or seed stage startup, you probably don't need to listen to this video any further. But if you're Series B or later or have 50 plus employees and are spending in the neighborhood of 30,000 plus on data per year, you should be considering this approach every time you think about renegotiating or re-entering contract phases. Probably every 1 to 2 years, you should be investigating data and following these steps. So step 1 is sort of laying out what are your must-have fields and the must-have things that this data provider must do, and understanding where each provider fits. Step 2, after that, it's engaging providers, getting sample data, and evaluating that data. This is going to take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks when done right. Evaluation inputs. So in order to evaluate a data provider against those 4 quadrants that I outlined, you're going to need 3 inputs. One is that you're going to need a set of criteria that you can leverage across data providers. For example, we recently gave some data providers a list of some industry criteria, some company location criteria, annual revenue criteria, and then a people filter criteria. Because we know that those are filters that our customers frequently like to use. And then we looked at the results. And then we took that to each platform and got results back. The second thing we got together was a list of emails that we knew were valid. So we essentially exported a list from our CRM, hid the email field, and just took the first name, last name, company domain field, imported it into the data provider and enriched it with a work email. And then we were able to compare the result of what we knew to be valid versus what the data provider returned. The last thing you want to do is take a list of domains, if you're going to use this provider for enrichment, and import it and enrich it and assess it against those key fields that matter to you. Once we get into it, let's talk about sort of evaluating the evaluation criteria one, which is size of universe. So this is pretty straightforward. You look at the total number of rows returned for your ICP criteria. And in this case, we see that provider 3 is the winner. Provider 1, which is our current provider, is doing quite well. Oops. And then providers 2 and 4 are, not doing so great. Provider 5 kind of, we'll just forget about them. They were a little bit out of the running for some other reasons, but seemed pretty high. The next step is we were going to look at that firmographic enrichment and dig in to see the fill rate of each field and to see how much more we could get from another data provider versus what we currently have. So for example, we look at this first row, annual revenue. We see that our current provider provides it 99% of the time. Provider 2 doesn't provide it at all. Provider 3, has 0.5% more than our current provider, so on and so forth. This helps us understand relative strengths and weaknesses at a field level, not just total number of rows, but also looking at columns, and within those columns, how much data do you have? Does a data provider have? Next up, we want to look at accuracy. There's no 100% source of truth for what accuracy is. I've talked about this before. I'll continue to talk about it ad nauseum. What is true is in the eye of the beholder. That being said, what is true to your salespeople is almost always going to be LinkedIn. Whether LinkedIn is actually true or not is more of a philosophical question. So what we do to compare accuracy is actually look at compare it against LinkedIn and then manually verify it. And that helps us understand how closely does this match with LinkedIn. If we need to tell a story around this data to our sales team, how do we tell that story? And then we can also compare data providers against each other, so it's relative accuracy to LinkedIn, and that helps us, again, judge, potential effectiveness. So our current provider seems to have a very high match rate against LinkedIn and is kind of winning. Fourth and final evaluation criteria. We take that list of CRM contacts, we export it, and we enrich it with work emails. And here we can see in the filled rows, we exported 2,500 contacts from HubSpot. Provider 1 was able to fill in 936.8% of those 2,500, and they achieved a 67% match rate back to those 2,500 emails that we know to be accurate. This helps us understand relative accuracy, right? A really good analysis that not enough companies do. The end result of all this is different strengths and weaknesses. Surprise, surprise. But ultimately it matters what's most important to you. Are you mainly going to use this? Are you mainly inbound driven and care about firmographic enrichment for lead qualification? Cool. Maybe the work email accuracy doesn't matter to you. Maybe you just really care about fill rate of certain fields and accuracy of those fields. Like I said before, the reality is you're going to likely end up with greater than one data provider. There's a slew of niche data providers like KeyPlay, GoodFit, Blueprint that provide more esoteric columns like jobs data or G2 scraped data that you're not going to get with an off-the-shelf data provider like Clearbit, Apollo, or ZoomInfo. And that's okay. You should not necessarily try to have a one-size-fits-all data provider. And then last but not least, with this kind of analysis complete, you can enter negotiations with a much clearer understanding of the value for money you're going to get. For example, how big the size of the universe is potentially of people that you want to target that the data provider has. You could do some back of the envelope math to say, if I were going to convert X percent of these through outbound, that would result in Y revenue. So therefore, the ROI on this data provider could be C. And that's absolutely critical to do to make sure that you don't have buyer's remorse several months later. And that's often the case that we have with data providers, is that people buy it without understanding exactly how they're going to use it, buy it without understanding the quality of the data, and then oftentimes overbuy in terms of number of credits or underbuy in terms of number of credits, and end up feeling like they got a raw deal. So follow these steps to make sure that you do data provider evaluations right, and you won't be in that boat.